let me just kind of like step back a little bit. So I think, we talked about, a decision is really just a prediction of the future, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, we'd like to have a crystal ball. So we're kind of trying to get as close to that as possible.
Mhm.
And when we think about that, and we talk about these two different influences, right? Which is luck, which, so let me just say that, so you have a particular option, and that option has a set of things that could occur that are associated with it. After you've chosen the option, that's where the influence of luck occurs, because you can sort of think about what those possible futures are, but you have no control whatsoever about which one you actually observe that particular time. So that's the influence of luck. But we have this other problem, which is the hidden information or incomplete information. And we can think about, we can be really amazing in terms of what our process is. And, we're going to forecast things, and all right, we know we're going to think about the different options, and we're going to forecast them, and we're going to think about what the expected value is. But if what's informing our decision isn't high quality, that house is going to fall down. Mm-hmm. And everything about this process that you're doing is trying to motivate you to deal with this informational problem, because that's the foundation on which this whole decision house is built. And we have a problem with that foundation. The first is that a lot of the stuff we believe is inaccurate. So let's call that cracks in the foundation. And the second is that we don't know very much. It's like a super flimsy foundation. So we can think about like the universe of stuff we know versus the universe of stuff we don't know, right? So the universe of stuff we know is like a speck of dust on the head of a pin. It's like Whoville. Uh-huh. And then the universe of stuff that we don't know is like the size of the actual universe.
Crazy big, yeah.
Yeah. So what we're trying to do is, how do we get stuff out of the universe of stuff we don't know into the universe of stuff we know to repair our foundation? Because we can solve both problems by exploring that universe of stuff that we don't know. So we can, that's where we're going to find ways to repair the inaccuracies, and that's where we're going to find new information. Mm-hmm. So, okay, so anything that I talk about is really focusing on that particular problem. So even when we talk about what are the steps for a good decision, the 6-step process, it's really meant to start getting you to ask questions, to seek knowledge, to explore the universe of stuff you don't know in a much more objective way, because we don't take random walks through that universe. We take very specific walks where we're particularly shining lights on stuff that confirms our beliefs, mm-hmm. and on people who believe the same things that we do, and information sources, right? Like, I don't know a lot of Bernie supporters who are spending their days watching Fox News. And I don't know a lot of Trump supporters who are spending their days watching MSNBC. So there you go. So that's kind of what we're trying to solve for. So let's now step back and say, okay, so what does a really good decision process look like? Well, it's got to be an accurate prediction of the future, as accurate as we can get. We're going to usually be pretty far off, but small differences are really good. If we can make small improvements, we're really good. So it starts with identify the reasonable set of possibilities. So we want to do, and by reasonable, I mean, I don't want you to sit there and like go down a rabbit hole of what if an asteroid hits Russia.
Right.
Okay. Why are you spending your time on that? You're trying to decide whether to release a particular piece of code. Yep. Right? Let's not worry about that. So what are the reasonable set of outcomes that actually matter for the decision that I'm making? And then you want to go farther than that, and you want to look at them and say, what is your preference for those outcomes? And that really just has to do with the payoff, right? So kind of what's going to get you the biggest bang for your buck of those possible outcomes that I'm considering if I choose this particular option. So how much is it going to advance me toward my goal? How much of it is going to advance me away? And we can think about that in a lot of different ways. It could be, for example, if I'm a founder, I'm trying to maximize how much information I'm going to get from any option I choose. So I could think about what of the set of possible outcomes is going to informationally give me the heaviest lift. It could be like if I'm trying to hire someone and turnover is just a mess, I may be very particularly worried about how long the employee is going to stay with the company. Yep. So we can think sort of broadly or narrowly about what those outcomes are and what payoffs we really care about, but we want to think about sort of what's the magnitude of the payoff, good or bad. And then we want to think about what's the probability of those things occurring, right? So that's obviously incredibly important, because otherwise we don't really know how to compare the good to the bad.
Yep.
It could be that there's like some disastrous outcome in there, but it's like really, really low probability, right? Likewise, there may be something that's very low probability on the good end, but it's got a big enough payoff that it outweighs the bad. So unless we combine these two things, the payoffs and the probability, it's very hard for us to think about what the quality of that option is. And then basically the rest of the steps are just to rinse and repeat.
Okay.
What are the options I have? Let me go through the same process, and then I can compare these things together to figure out which option is going to be more likely to get me to advance toward my goal in a way that has obviously the appropriate risk associated with it, right? Because you always have to be thinking about those extreme downside outcomes.
Yeah, and it's interesting because where your thinking influenced us was, it's tempting to say, here's my investment thesis. I think if we invest in this company, it's going to win because of A, B, and C. But that's a very immature way to frame the decision, right? You're far better off, and I think you also said this in Thinking in Bets. You're far better off having the first sentence be, first off, I'm not certain, but here's how I'm thinking about the range of potential outcomes and the probabilities and what it would mean for us, in terms of investment profits. And now we can have a discussion about, say, those 5 branches and those probabilities and those things that could go right or wrong. But now it's no longer I'm attached to whether it's going to be, a fund returner. It's just like, well, there's a scenario where it is. There's maybe a scenario where it returns more than the fund. But for me to sit here and say that I know what's going to happen, and that I need to convince you it's going to happen for us to write the check, is just wrong-headed, right? And similarly in startups, it's so much better, I find, for people to say, look, it's not your opinion versus mine. Let's frame the bet together, and like the bet goes on the whiteboard, and then once we make the bet, we're going to put it in time capsule, and we're going to come back after we see the outcome and look at how the outcome, how do you compare and contrast it with the bet. Yeah. This is what I love about your knowledge tracker, right?
What I think is, you said 2 really great things in there. I mean, you said many great things in there, but there's 2 that I want to come back to. The first was when you were saying, like, we really want to think about not just like what's our thesis and, is it going to be a winner or a loser? But you want to be specific about what that means, right? So, you're approaching it from, okay, I'm not certain. So let me think about what are the different outcomes? What are the probabilities they could occur? Let me really try to think about what I mean when I say this is the bet we're making. What do I mean when I say, I think this is going to be a fund returner? Like, how can I say that in a way where I really understand how I unpack that?
That's right.
Right. So like, as an example, like, you might say something like, well, I think that even though the economics aren't exactly what we would want for this company, I think this is going to create really good signal for other founders with us. So that's something that people would say, well, what do you mean by that? How much signal? How much is that going to increase the probability that a founder is going to pick us?
Right.
How much is that going to increase the quality of our funnel, right? Like, of the top of our funnel. Like, you have to actually specify what you mean. And that's where I get back to the decision process is really about this knowledge problem. Because when you force yourself to go through this process, you start asking, what do I know and what do I mean? And if I don't know what I mean, how can I go find it out?
Yeah.
Right.
And it's the other thing I learned was, like, by framing it in a set of outcomes, you can avoid traps that you don't even see. So, for example, pricing. A lot of founders that I've run into that have struggled with pricing, they make a couple mistakes. One is they just have the discussion too late with the customer because they're afraid to. But now let's say they're going to have the discussion. It's tempting to think, I need to get this price to cover my costs. And then frame it as, can I get that price or not get that price? But if you think in bets, that's not the right way to think. The right way to think is there's a range of prices you might get, and you should run a test. So like when I was working with Chegg, which does textbook rentals, Osman Rashid was like, well, we got to get, if it's $100 new textbook, we got to be able to rent it for 35, or we don't have a business. But his insight was, I'm not going to ask, will you pay 35 to rent it? He's like, I'm going to test. Will they pay 35, 45, 55, 65, 75? And what we found was that a lot of students would rather rent a textbook for $65 than pay $100 for it new, which was way better than we'd hoped. But if you frame the test incorrectly, you never get that information, right? You would have never known that you can get an even better outcome than you possibly imagined you were going to get. And so like, but that's kind of like taking the outside view versus the inside view. The inside view would have been, how much money do we need to get to be profitable or for this to be business for us? But that doesn't really matter, right? Because pricing isn't a math problem, it's a psychology problem. What we needed to understand was what the outsiders thought it was worth to rent a textbook. And you have to run that test and test those outcomes independent of what your costs are.
Right. So I love that example, because basically what you're saying is, okay, we're thinking about what the buckets are here, right? What are the bins that we're forecasting?
Right.
And we can say, would they rent it for 20, between 20 and 30, 30 and 40, 40 and 50, 50 and 60, 60 and 70, 70 and 80, 80 and 90.
Right.
Right. So you can just say that, and all right, let's try to put a probability on these things. And everybody's going to go, ooh, this is really hard because we don't really know. We don't, because nobody's ever done this before, or, there's not enough data for us to answer it. And then of course, what comes from that, and that's what I'm saying about a good decision process, really makes you start to think about, what can I go find out?
Right.
And now that's where that naturally comes from, that is that you say, oh, you're making me forecast this stuff. What can I find out that's a reasonable cost for me to go find it out? Mm-hmm. That's going to allow me to actually better understand how I'm supposed to forecast these different bins.
Yep.
And then naturally what comes out of that is, well, maybe I could ask some people.